far good here. Okay. So here we go. So first, we're going to talk about invasive species. And I don't know if you remember, first of all, I'll be happy to know where you are with UDI. And so what did you learn with UDI? So I'm not going to talk too much of the same things and try to get the different angle on whatever you talked about. So you had, after you had a talk with me, you had with UDI talk about coral reefs, correct?
Yes, correct.
What else? Oh no. Mangroves?
Yeah, we discussed their functioning, like from between maritime to terrain as well, and their sort of the structuring and the whole sort of background behind them.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the importance of mangroves as well.
Can I ask a quick question? I just wanted to verify, Isaac and I are doing our presentations on June 11th, correct, for invasive species? This is what Hudi spoke with us. I just wanted to double check.
I had no idea. Honestly, I didn't look at the... So you're supposed to talk about invasive species?
Yes, Isaac and I are, but I believe that I just received an email that we're actually going to present on the 11th, but me and Isaac and I were unaware of when it'll be, so I just wanted to double check.
I don't know, but what I remember we talked about is that in the beginning of the week, which you're supposed to present, you send the presentation to us, and then we give you some comments, and then we weren't sure exactly. It would be perfect for us to have a different session, but probably it's difficult for the university to do that. So that's how we decided to intertwine it, which we think is not as good, but it's the best of what we can do. So if you're not ready for today, you're not ready for today. That's fine.
So I'll just take his email, what he said based off the email, and for June 11th. So I
you have a meeting June 11th. You have a meeting with whom?
With Hudi for the presentations. He just emailed. So I just wanted to double check that you got that as well.
For all the presentations?
No, just for those who haven't yet presented and are supposed to for their topics.
Okay.
I'm unaware as well. So I just wanted.
I didn't get that message, so I'm not aware of this. Okay, so it'll be fine. Don't worry about that. So I'm going to talk about invasive species today, and also about human impacts on the environment. All right, let's start invasive species. Happy. I showed this one before. This is when we talked about what's the difference in between the east and west in the Mediterranean Sea. We talked about many things that happen in the Mediterranean Sea, and we mentioned that there's less nutrients in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. There's less fauna, less flora as well. And the only thing which we were really, really high on was invasive species. So you can see invasive species, alien species here. You can see the numbers are relatively high in this section over here. And as you go to the western side, there's hardly any. You can see this is from low to high. Don't look at the numbers, but this is low to high in the colors. And the other thing you can see that what we always see is we see it's all in the coastal areas. That's usually because that's where people check them. So people don't go too far into the middle of the ocean and check them as well. That's one reason. The second reason is most species are, their habitat is close to the coastal habitat. So that's where we see most of the organisms, and that's usually how they move around from one place to another. So we know that one of the important things about the Mediterranean Sea is that it's a hub for invasive species. We're going to talk about it and see some examples today. That's the idea. So what's an invasive species? You go. Your turn.
It's something that doesn't belong in the environment.
It's can you hear?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, I was gonna say that it's pretty much just not, I think, an endemic species to a certain region, and they can sort of come in whether they're a keystone species or not, but their purpose is that they challenge local species with niches and pose the risk of outcompeting and stress and putting stresses on the biodiversity and the whole network and sort of system that's been implemented within them. Well, at least specifically now we're speaking about the marine systems.
Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting to see. So I just want to know, you learned about this somewhere?
So I studied natural resource conservation for my undergrad, but my my final paper for ecology last semester was on the Argentine ants and their invasive impacts, anthropogenic and ecological.
And in the program, you learned about invasive species in general, or
In ecology?
We discussed
in ecology, you
yeah.
did?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, so hopefully now it's going to be a little bit more. So I'm going to be a little bit more extensive probably about what you learned about before, and give you the inputs about the Mediterranean Sea, which are interesting. All right, so let's go. So you're pretty right. This is much it. The thing is, there's a lot of definitions too. You can see various definitions here, like species introduced in regions outside of the historic post-glacial native range. And as you said before, those who came from other locations to new locations. And the question is, what is a new location? And also to define what is an invasive species. Is an invasive species not natural? I mean, there's also natural dispersal. So how would you define something as invasive rather than something which isn't just natural dispersal?
Well, non-native. It's not. I mean, essentially. Well, I guess the biggest discussion is more, I mean, there's some definitions that define it, that invasive exotic species are sort of a byproduct of anthropogenic activities and just the influence. But I mean, it's something that's it's essentially something that is out of the ordinary that has occurred, has granted a non-native species to arrive.
Right. So basically, it's also an issue of time. So it's something that presents itself usually from an area which is quite far away, meaning that geographically it came from a very different place and not from a place nearby, and it happens relatively quickly. And we're going to talk about how it happens. Or maybe you talked about it before, but it's something dramatic. And the thing about it, it's relatively new about the study about the invasive species. I'm going to give a mention about it as well. Just to know, there's lots of names for invasive species. I call it invasive species. You can call it exotic species, alien species, non-indigenous species, non-native species, introduced species, colonized species, and there's probably a number of lists. So there's all of these basically tell you the same thing. So just to be aware.
But it's not just caused by anthropogenic factors, right? Like it is natural.
No, the idea is about invasive species that it's not natural, and this is how we define it. It's one of the things that we know, that invasive species come to a new area. If it's well, you can define it as well as a natural, but natural is probably, most people that talk about exotic species, I mean, think about it this way, or non-indigenous species, they talk about something which is not natural in their essence. And although by definition, invasive species can be also natural. So
like
how you define
sometimes they can move with a storm, for example.
Yeah, I'm going to show an example. Okay, so we're going to go over these, and I'll share some examples of these things. So usually it's introduced in new areas, and usually also, as you mentioned, it causes problems or changes in a new area which they arrive to. So there's a negative, the name invasive species entails usually a negative side, not necessarily a positive side to this. So we're going to talk about pathways of how they introduce themselves by invasive species from marine environment, of course. Some of the successful ecological perspectives. What makes an invasive species successful? The impacts, and this, hopefully some solutions. We'll see how much time we have. All right, pathways of invasion. All right, check this out. And I want you to see this from going from the bottom to the top. And this is different ways of which, different pathways which invasive species can go from one place to another. They divided it to various ways. One by dispersal, the other one is vector, meaning moving by a different organism, like taking a hitchhike. And other thing which we talk about is community and the changes in the community itself and how they move from one place to another just by entering or infiltrating a new environment. And the idea is to moving from unintentional introduction to intentional introduction. So just to see how it is. So in the beginning, we talk about unaided, and this is basically naturally. And it can have also dispersal by corridors, which obviously has been done, but it's unintentional. And we're going to see that as well here. And canals usually is the main form of dispersal, which is unintended. I mean, they didn't build the corridor and specifically said, we're going to bring a new invasive species or new species to the area. That was not the intention. It's a side effect of what happened. Another way of summing this is stowaways, usually by fouling organisms. We're going to talk about this, like ballast water, the fouling. And then we start talking about things which are much more intentional. One is contaminants, which is usually just those that take a ride and also very much to stowaway, what happens naturally, or usually introduced when we're moving from one organism to another, basically creating a small epidemic in a certain area, usually by pests. And we have fish parasites that have that as well. We have escape from aquariums. And the last thing we have is release of organisms which are not local to the area, and that species becomes invasive to a new area. Basically, we're introducing, and we're not doing it intentionally, but there's definitely an intention of doing that. So let's have a look at all these and then try to take them a little bit more into details. So from non-aiding to human aid. Check this out. This is a species of organism called, it's a coral called Stelaphora pistillata. It's one of the most global organisms you can find in corals, as far as I know. It's very, very common. And the thing about it used to be said that it's, look at this. This is Australia, and there's Stelaphora pistillata, and it's Australia. And we are in Israel. We have Stelaphora pistillata here in Israel, in the Red Sea. And all this area that you can see, which is colored, all of them have Stelaphora. Actually, it's all over here as well. So this is like a broad range organism. And the question is, how can you have an organism which started its life probably somewhere and basically dispersing to almost everywhere in the world where corals can actually survive? And that was the common thought. The common thought was Stelaphora is started somewhere and moved around because of conditions, usually by stepping stones. I don't know if you learned this in ecology. And it moved and moved and moved and slowly became an organism which you can find almost everywhere. Today, we know that it's not exactly like this. We know there's different clades, and you can see different clades here. And we believe that it's not only one organism, it could be more than one organism, meaning it's one more species, more than one species. Just to let you show how it can work out. If you want to have natural dispersal, you need to have high fecundity, meaning those produce a lot of propagules. And most of the corals, specifically this one, is a spawner. So it produces a lot of them, a lot of eggs and zygotes, and become the plant move in the water. It has strong vegetative or asexual reproduction. You can see asexual reproduction here. This is not in the coral, but just to show you how it is similar. In corals like this, which are hard corals, they break down and then they move around. And sometimes they get stuck and they can live well. There's the propagules live for a relatively long time. They have phenotypic plasticity, and just want to show you at the bottom here, all of these from the Red Sea, Taiwan, Chagos, which is the middle of the Indian Pacific Ocean, and Madagascar, all of them are Stelaphora pistillata. Check them out, they're very similar, but they don't look exactly the same. And we believe that one of the things that they said at the beginning, that there's a big plasticity, but it's still the same organism. They're generalist, we can find them everywhere, and they're very common in all of these areas. And basically we consider them as R strategists. You know what an R strategist is? Have you learned this?
Yeah, we talked about it in ecology.
In ecology? Okay, I'll just give a quick repetition. And our strategies are those that can produce quickly, live quiet, live short lives, produce quickly, grow quickly, and don't take care of their propagule, don't take care of their offspring, and that's the way of mode. We're exactly the opposite, humans. We grow slowly, we produce slowly, we have very few organisms, very few offsprings, we take care of them very much, and we also, and this is just a different strategy of reproduction, basically. So if you have all these conditions, you can have a natural spawn, a natural dispersal. So this is the question: is it natural or not? We don't. We know it's natural, but is it the same species or not? We're not really sure. Okay, just to let you show you different organism. This is the planula of an organism which is called Polyphoa. It's a zoantella. It's a very similar to a coral, and it's basically, you can find it everywhere. You can find it in Japan, the Red Sea, Australia, and here you can see the survival rate of this moving thing, the planktonic stage, meroplankton, in the water. You can see some of them, most of them die in the beginning, but some of them can survive more than 160 days. So, and they flow in the water, and they can still be productive in metamorphose where if they found a new place to get help. So this is a very strong mode of dispersal. And we do see this in different kinds of organisms. And we know for sure that this, for instance, this organism, by genetically checking, is the same species. Another way of going of doing stowaways. Stowaway is going back, actually, yeah, I'm confused it. Yeah, hold on a second. Okay. What I forgot to put is corridors. I'm going to talk about corridors anyhow. Corridors is we have the biggest corridor, and I'm going to go here and explain to you the corridor, the shipping routes here. You can see the shipping routes everywhere in the world. It's not, and you can see that there's a big shipping route going from the Japan area to the States, from across the Pacific Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean has a lot of routes. But anyone who would like to go from this area to these areas here, almost none of them will go around, though all of them will have to go through the Red Sea, cross the Suez Canal, which is a corridor, and then cross Gibraltar and go the other way, or go to this area here in Europe. So it's basically a great way for organisms to take a ride and cross areas and boundaries, geographical boundaries, and just basically take a hike. Zebras are an example of zebra mussels. I'm going to talk to you about zebra mussels. So, because they have a disaster, the cost of zebra mussels is ridiculously high. So this is exactly a way.
Sorry, what was the name of that mussel?
Zebra mussel.
Oh.
I'm going to show you examples, okay? And I want you to show you this. This is the pathways of invasion. And you can see invasive marine species, and you can see the main routes and where they're going to and where they're coming from. And you can see most of the places they go through the Mediterranean Sea. And you can see the amount of invasive species in the Red Sea accordingly is quite high. So one of the major, the reasons that we have a lot of invasive species in the Red Sea is actually twofold. One is the corridor, but the second one, I'm going to talk about corridor, is pathways. Basically taking a hike, stowaways. So how did they do it? You can see over here an example of water discharging. You see the water here? And this is what they call ballast water. And I'll show you how the example works, how they can hitchhike from one place to another. Two ways of doing it. One is by ballast water, and they're discharged. So let's start here. If you have a boat, not a boat, a ship, and it brings cargo from one place to another. So this is maybe the source port over here. And what happens to the ship? It's intended to be a little bit in the water to give it stability. So what happens is when the ship is empty, they'll have to load it with some water, and they have different they have specific compartments to add water into. So they pump water from the environment and add it onto the ship itself. And then when they do that, tiny organisms get along as well. So basically now they're here, and they can move around from one place to another, and they can hitchhike. So they go around, and now they're in the compartments here. There's no cargo, empty cargo. And once they go here, somewhere in the mid, well, not somewhere, at the end, when they reach the destination port, they dump the water and they load the ship with the cargo. Now it's full enough, and then they could go and cross back to the same place that they came from, or go to a different place. So basically, these tiny organisms took a ride from one place, from the source port to a destination port. And here they're dumped out.
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
So how big or how large can the fish be? Like, can, like, say dolphins, can they go in there as well, or just smaller fish?
No, it's actually usually not fish at all. It's usually tiny organisms, meaning usually the dispersal stages, meroplanktonic dispersal stages of various organisms. Most of them actually are invertebrates. Almost all of them are invertebrates. Examples of was the zebra mussel, which you just mentioned about, which took probably a different way. But all these tiny organisms, they're microscopic. So basically, you don't see, you just see that you're pumping water into the ship, and then you're dumping the water out, and you don't see any difference. What you're actually doing, you're taking organisms from one area, and you're dumping them in a different area. And if they can survive, then you have there's a chance of them becoming an invasive species. Okay. Wonderful.
Yes, thank you so much.
So how does it work? I mean, so the way to battle this is, since people know this for a very long time. So the idea is how to battle this is there's two ways of doing it. One way of doing it is treating it. You can see here, if you get water coming in, I can treat the water that I'm pumping in, and there's various ways to do it. And you can see here, you can do filtration. That's one way of doing it. And sometimes it's just the first way. And then the second way is you can do chemical, physical filtration or treatment. You can just kill them all with some chemicals, but then you have to dump it to the environment, which is sometimes difficult. Some chemicals are not very, like fluorine, for instance, and I don't know the name in English. Oh, I know the name in Hebrew. H2O2 they're not very when you dump it in the water, they become very diluted. They're very easy they're not very harmful. And physically, you can have UV radiation, which is probably the most common thing they can do. They do that in ponds, for instance. That's how they usually treat ponds. If you have a fish pond, for instance. So this is one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is taking stocks in the middle of the ocean and dumping the water and then bringing new water in. So you don't take the one organism all the way to a new geographic area. You just dump it from one top. You just dump it and exchange the water. So this is probably the two ways that are logical to be done. And obviously clean the ballast, discharge of land where it's possible. There's various ways of doing it. Do you know what's the problem? Do you know what's the problem? Does it work? Yeah, hydrogen peroxide. Thank you very much, Hani.
I wonder if, I don't know if this is it at all, but like, I guess you're still dumping species, but like when the reason why they have ballast water inside of the big ships is to balance it as well, especially when they have cargo in it. So I don't know if it's also like a danger because of that.
Oh, this is exactly what they have ballast water is, because when there's no cargo, they need to have weight in order for the ship to be balanced. The problem with this is not how do you deal with the problem with the water management of ballast water, is that it made it lots of rules. And what you see here is these different rules for, you can see, I don't know what's written here, can't see this. draft the Mediterranean strategy of ships, ballast water management, and invasive species, early 2012. And there's different actions to be done, and people are aware of that. The problem is there's no enforcement because most of it is done in the middle of the sea. I mean, if you want to dump things in the middle of the sea, you can do that. So they do try to do some things, and it's very, very, very limited. And it's extremely difficult to have to enforce these international laws, basically international laws. So that's one of the major problems with the ballast water. The other way of taking a hitch is fouling. Fouling is various organisms have the ability to stick themselves to a surface. And you can see an example, a ridiculous example of a yacht, which hasn't been taken out of the water for a long time. You can see this is called fouling. Fouling is an organism which is getting clung to usually the bottom of ships. And there's various ways of doing it. And you can probably know these you know this, for instance, barnacles are very common, ascidians are very common, and mussels are very, very common. And you can see here also a lot of, what do you call this? A lot of algae, which is less common. And the idea about this, it's very costly. To move a boat like this is very expensive. You can see the cost of fouling is expensive. So a lot of people are trying to do is take them off. And this is probably the best thing you can do is keep the boats clean. And the idea about this is don't give them a chance to take a ride from one place to another. So clean the boat in the place where you are and then move around if you're traveling away. All right, contaminants. Told you about the parasites. There's a possibility of having parasites which have been introduced to a new area. These parasites can be dramatic to an area, and then it can actually have dramatic effects. This is the salmon fluke. It's a tiny organism. It's a flatworm, and it's a monogenean, and you don't see it in the eye. This is why you see it here in the picture with a scanning electron microscope. And they attach themselves outside, or what we call ectoderms, outside on the skin of usually fish. And this has done a dramatic effect on the salmon aquaculture. Not only the aquaculture, also the natural environment. So it came by aquaculture, most likely, we don't know. And we know that it can actually move because things that people are moving them, organisms from one place to another, they can go from one catchment to another. So if you have it on one stream, for instance, we know that they can travel from one place, not travel, but they can be transferred from one river to another. And there's areas you can see where people are very aware of it, that these things have happened before. And when that happens, all of the salmon populations, and for instance, in this example, are basically declining or almost disappearing. So this is a major deal. It happened also in aquaculture. In aquaculture, they treat it with different various ways, sometimes nasty, but in a natural environment, you just don't want them to be inside. And there's no actually remedy to this. All right, let's go and be more and more human intensive. Escape. I want to show you an example of this. This is probably the most common example of escape. And this is an escape from aquarium, which we think happened in the aquarium. And this is actually about Caulerpa. Caulerpa is in the Mediterranean Sea, and it was originally, it's common in the northern part of the Mediterranean Sea. And what happened is Caulerpa was used in aquariums. And in 1984, apparently, in Monaco, they released some of them to the environment. So we see here, it's also released that we talked about before. I'm going to put all of them together. And look what happened. In 1984, they know that some have been released to the area. And look what happened is that the amount of area which has been infected by taxifolia is ridiculously high, very high. The sad thing about it, that's also quite, this organism is relatively toxic, and it reduced it had a great impact on the local environment. And look how quickly it went by and grew dramatically. Within about 5 years, we talk about this movement here from here to here. Now, this is not the first time. This is the first time we saw this. And in 2012, 2000, the same species was introduced in California. So this is a little bit later, after we know about what happened in the Mediterranean Sea. So what do you think happened? Did they have the same impact or not? Before I'm going forward.
Well, maybe not, because the ocean would be much colder in California than in the Mediterranean.
Okay, although we're talking about the northern part of the northwest Mediterranean Sea, so it's relatively cold, not too far off.
Did it not have as much of a competitive advantage in the ecosystems off of California? Like, were there other species that were better prepared to
Okay.
outcompete it?
So this is a nice, basically nice case study, because this is probably the first time that they knew about an organism which was very well identified as an invasive species. And then they found this invasive species in a totally new area, probably by escape as well, by aquariums, we don't know. And the question is, if you deal with it, how you deal with it. Let me show you how this works out. I'm going to do this. What they decided is to do a massive plan to try and eradicate the organism before it spreads out. Check this out, the organism. They had they pumped some chlorine in organisms which were in the water. They tried to cut off as much as they can. They have sucking devices, manual uprooting, you can see here. They used ice to kill them, and they bleached them as well. So they had like various ways of they decided trying to kill him. And what do you think? Success or no?
I don't think so.
Okay. I wish I could do a poll. There's no polling in this. Okay. So I'll show you what happened. First of all, a little bit about this. 52% of Southern California aquarium is sold Caulerpa. And they sold them, some of them sold it as live rock. I don't know if you know this. They even didn't know about this until it actually grows. And the idea about this was, if we're going to do this, we're going to try and ban the selling of, first of all, of Caulerpa for the aquarium trade. And try to do some educational brochures and collect samples of everything and basically ban it. And check this out. This is what happened. This is the cover of Toxifolia, Caulerpa toxifolia, summer 2000. Within a year, it went down to almost nothing. So this is a great success. Unfortunately, this is probably the only cases that I'm aware of that this actually happened and successfully was eradicated. In Israel, unfortunately, we're not doing very well.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because the reason why I said no is because it was based off my knowledge of what's happening in the Mediterranean. So that was interesting.
This is exactly right. Let me show you another example. This is a relatively relevant example of something which is dramatic, and also in the United States and the Caribbean, is the introduction of what we call a voracious predator. This is basically, I forgot the name, lionfish. And you can check this out. I'm going to, hold on, I'm going to show you, there's a tiny movie I'm going to show you. Let me see this. And it's not a movie, it's a site. And I'm going to show you this in a second. And you can see, in the site, you can see how they spread out. It's really, really amazing to show it. I'm going to share it with you. You see it, by the way? Do you see what I see, guys?
Yeah.
Okay. Check out. Somewhere in Miami in 1997. Do you see the years, Cohen? 2000, 2001, 2002. It's It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. So this is how an organism, this is a typical way of showing an organism, an invasive species, and how it spreads in an area. This is only the Caribbean area, just to let you know, this is South America. We know that in the southern part of South America now, there's lionfish. More south of Rio de Janeiro. So if you know the map. So it's really, really basically gone all over the area, which is relative between hot to mildly hot, and actually survived and actually made its base over there.
Where is it originally from? Miami?
No, actually, it's not originally from Miami, and the belief is that it was released from aquarium. It was not. There was none of them in that area, and people used to say, "Oh, it's beautiful. It's very common, very exotic." For instance, the Red Sea it's full of them because it's endemic to this area. It's not endemic, but it's all this area here is full of them. Also, all the way in the Indo-Pacific. In the Caribbean, they never had them. It was never there. So
I had a question about the question about the example you gave before, where the treatment was actually successful.
Yes.
What was the impact for the environment for the species around? Because they used like a lot of different methods. So did that have any impacts like on the environment in general?
Well, most likely there's a local impact. You have to sacrifice something in order to gain something. If you use chlorine, for instance, it's very soluble in water, so it doesn't have a major impact. If you clean the environment with scraping and you scrape everything, I guess there's local impact to it. But it's a question what will happen if you don't have it, and everything is going to be completely full of algae. And I'm going to talk about this in the next lecture. We're going to start something about phase shifts, which is important. Let me show you some more examples about what does it mean, the impact of an invasive species. And the reason I'm showing you this is because this is an example, this case study is many people are checking this out, and it's a good case study to example the behavior of invasive species in the marine environment. And you can see pretty much the picture that we just saw. This is the lionfish abundance, it's log, and you can see the years, and look what happened in 2006, just went really, really high and stayed high. That's the idea. And why is it important is that the fact is that what they do is the change, you can see here the change in the biomass of various small, relatively small fish, native species. And you can see if 0 was about what's normally the biomass that you have, after the introduction, you can see there's a reduction in small species, small-bodied species of prey and non-prey, and also large-bodied species. So what basically means that the introduction of lionfish is that they're eating these organisms, the various species here, for either competitors or non-competitors. Basically, they're depleting the small fish in that area. This can have a huge impact over a long time, from points of view, either from a food web point of view, and also from the balance in the ecology. And if you take a functional group and you take it out, now it doesn't do its work in the ecosystem, and there's an imbalance in the ecosystem. And how they decided to battle this, want to see?
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Why would there be a reduction in large-bodied non-competitors of the lionfish?
Usually because the large-bodied non-competitors. Honestly, I don't know.
I think aren't lionfish apex considered because they don't really have too many predators of their own?
Well, we know that they don't have too many.
Yeah, because of that. So wouldn't that essentially mean that they're just apex in that aspect?
No, because I mean, if they're not competitors, then it means the interaction of those species with the lionfish shouldn't affect their population sizes.
But they could be a keystone species. So essentially, they're just their like involvement in that ecosystem or that those connections have such a big influence. Like I know, for example, like seaweed forests, let's say dolphins are keystone species to a lot of seaweed forests, and protecting like how their effects, how it affects like with the competitors or like prey that are eating upon the seaweed forest, and then the dolphins sort of clearing that up. It's sort of like the similar thing with that lionfish have a sort of influence upon those other species, and that's what defines as like a keystone species. So they might not necessarily compete, but they sort of influence
Like an
other
indirect effect, maybe.
Yeah, I guess I can see that, like a ripple through the food web, sort of.
Yeah,
Right.
like eutrophication almost as well.
Right. So this is my assumption, but I'll take a look at the paper and give you very quickly. I'll give you a response. Okay. And wait, we have a half an hour break. I'll check it out. But this is what I think as well as an indirect effect of the ecosystem. Okay, I don't know what you guys are seeing, but do you see what I see? Do you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do.
Okay, so I'm just going to show you what people are trying to do. And do you hear it or not? You probably don't hear it, right?
No, we don't.
I always
Press
forget.
play on it.
I always forget where you put the sound on. Can someone remind me where you put the sound on?
I'm not sure if we hear because maybe if you press play, we do. I'm not sure.
No,
Yeah,
no.
just press play for a sec because maybe we'll hear it. I think we did for a moment. No, we don't hear it.
You don't hear
No.
it. Okay, hold on. Okay. Okay, let's go back.
It's likely that the invasion started sometime in the mid-1980s.
Yeah.
That's when the first reported sighting was of lionfish, just north of Miami. You have an animal that, once it invades, can really increase in population numbers very rapidly. Well, lionfish really are sort of the perfect storm. I think in many ways, as invasive species goes, they have a lot of characteristics which make them very successful in the invaded range. They reproduce very early in life, so they reach maturity, they grow very rapidly. They're capable of dispersing large distances during their egg and larval phase, which ride ocean currents. A species that has venomous spines. They don't seem to have many native predators or predators in their invaded range here, so it's possible that because they're so armored with the venomous spines that they don't have a lot of natural predators, which would lead them to basically not worry about being eaten. In general, one of the major impacts that we're going to find from this is essentially the fact that they're eating a whole variety of our native species. For one, they're removing prey that would have been available for many of our native fish stocks, like snapper and grouper, that are feeding on similar small-bodied reef fishes. They're also certainly having a direct predatory impact on many of those small reef fishes. And while we don't fish for those species perform important ecological services on the reef. Very little is known about lionfish biology and ecology. Our research program on lionfish here in northeastern Florida is trying to characterize a lot of the life history traits of lionfish. So we're looking at things like how fast do they grow, how many times do they reproduce, how many eggs do they produce. Most of the fish that we get for our work is actually through collaborations with local fishermen. Many of those folks are very interested, obviously, in what's going on with their ecosystem. It supports their livelihood, and so they're very eager to help for our part. We get to get samples from a huge geographic area that would cost us thousands of dollars to run our own research program. I think the best chance we have to mitigate some of the impacts of lionfish is to encourage fishery removals, whether that's through recreational spear fishermen or whether that's through the development of a commercial lionfish fishery, whether that be through traps or spearfishing or any of these other gear types, but just get a larger fraction of these fish out of the water. I think right now the best strategy we have for controlling the fish is human consumption. If we can increase the amount harvested through a variety of ways, increase demand for this species in both seafood markets increase demand in terms of restaurants to get restaurants to carry it. At this point, no one's talking about eradication, of course. But again, if you can have enough effort and mitigate, it should have been shown at relatively small scales that can dent the population, and you can see rebounds in some of the native fish species.
Scary, isn't it?
Yeah, is there already a demand like of restaurants or like for food for the human food market?
I don't know about the demand, but I can tell you that I had one many years ago, and it's pretty tasty.
Yeah, okay.
Hey,
That was my
man.
question.
Yeah, it has good food. It's good food source. For instance, here in Eilat, in the Red Sea, the species is a protected species, and I will mention now about corridors and talk about this specifically because it's very important for the Red Sea, for the Mediterranean Sea. But we do have an increase in the amount of lionfish in the Mediterranean Sea, and I think about a year ago, they started a program where they are allowing certain people to take them out, as I just saw before a second ago. So this is a new thing in the Mediterranean Sea. We're very afraid that we're going to have too many. Lots of them are going to have same species, same effect that we just saw in the Caribbean. Let's see if we will be happy at the end. Corridors, okay? So I give it a special one because it's very important for this area, because we have the Suez Canal. Suez Canal is a very long canal. It's very shallow, which should be mentioned. That connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. And basically, it's a connection that we saw before from the Indo-Pacific area to Europe. And big ships cross this area, and the Egyptians make a lot of money because it's expensive to cross it. But they're not the only ones that cross it. Organisms cross it as well. Not only fish, but mostly other species. So let's have a look at how they do it. So this is, instead of going around, just cross over and save a lot of money. It's much better to save that. And then also, by the way, it's relatively better.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
In your opinion, would you say that invasive species through marine systems, being introduced to marine systems, occurs more through like jump dispersal, like long jump dispersal, or through corridors?
It's hard to tell, I'll be honest, because there are examples of this and example of that. And for instance, here in Israel, we know that there's I don't know if you've been to the beaches or you're coming to the beaches now, but there's a lot of stingers now, or will be. Not now, but there will be. And they were never here before. We're not sure where how they came from, but the origin is from South America. We know they're here. Although most of the species that we have here in this area is because of Suez Canal, most of the invasive species. And the Mediterranean Sea is the biggest, it's the most infected area by invasive species in the world. So it's very difficult to say. And I tend to believe that crossing corridors gives the species that try to invade a better chance to make it on the other side because it's more gradual.
I see. All right, thank you.
But this is just a thought. It's not really bounded by anything else.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I understand what you mean by that. Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, so those who migrate, we call them the Sepsian migrants because the person who built it was a French guy whose name was Sleps. He built the Suez Canal. It's called the Sepsian migration. And those who can cross from the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea is the opposite direction. We call it anti-Lesepsia, but it's quite uncommon. Most of what we see is the Sepsian migration, meaning from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. And you can see here the spread of various organisms. I don't remember exactly which ones they are. And you can see crossing from this area and all the way around, going to the north and crossing, well, not crossing, but almost crossing to the western side of the Mediterranean Sea. Basically infecting the eastern area of the Mediterranean Sea. And I want you to look at the years 1976, and here we go, 1986, 1988, 2006, and going forward. So some species are found before, some species are found other, and that's the reason. You know why the reason they're going this way, not the opposite way, by the way?
Ocean
Is it?
currents?
Yeah.
Yep, ocean currents, exactly. Remember, they're small and they move around, and a lot of them, the propagals are moving forward. So they have an organism that stays here. His offspring are going to be probably found here and here and here and here and so forth. So that's how they move, by currents. That's how it usually moves and happens. That's what happens. The dispersal is by the water. And that's the one I talked to you about a second ago, the stingers that we have. Oh, so this is the Opilema nomadica. You can see them starting in this area and crossing from one place to another. So we're quite sure that this organism came by crossing the Suez Canal, and we're not sure if it's by boats or by just crossing from one place to another, because we don't see many of them in the Red Sea on this side. But it's quite extensive, and you can see the invasive species is really, really dramatic. This is in 2012, it's quite old, and the numbers are higher today. You can see the amount of species crossing. This is fish, and you can see this is a relevant number just to see how it increased. Look at that. And 50 of them arrived in the past decade. Of the fish caught by 54% caught by fisheries in Israel is not local species. They're invasive species. And this image is quite disturbing. So today, a lot of people, when they want to get information, they get information from the fishermen to understand what's going on about the local environment. There's a very prominent Israeli ichthyologist. His name is Dani Golani, and he works a lot on these organisms. And most of the examples that you see here is he is actually identifying them, and he's working and collaborating with people in Turkey and Italy just to assess how big the infestation is. And it's dramatic. I can tell you it's quite dramatic. Just to see different examples, all of them came from the Red Sea. Some of them are poisonous, like these two, very poisonous. Some of them are not, but this one is very, these two actually, they're quite important because both of them, they eat algae. And algae, if there's too much algae in the environment, then other organisms cannot survive. So it's really important to have a herbivorous fish in the environment. If you have too much of it, you're also changing the environment. So it's quite important to understand that their functional group, what their ecological niche is very important for the survivorship of the ecosystem that they're being introduced to. So we know that there's other invasions as well, not only Suez Canal, by the way. Panama Canal is also doing a good job, and also other places. And just to show you what's going on with invasions in Israel, and so not in Israel, in the Mediterranean Sea. And you can see here, hold on a second. You can see here, by crossing, this is from Galil and Rilov. F is fish, C is crustacean, M is mollusks. And you can see that almost all of them, black is of Pacific origin, and Atlantic is crossing from Gibraltar. And you can see as we go from this area towards the western part, you can see there's more invasive species that come from Atlantic area. This is here from the Pacific area. So this is definitely, we know that they came from the Suez Canal. And the sad thing about it, as we see, there's a mix happening in this area. And there's also a relatively good number of Pacific organisms in the western side. So we know that that this is crossing from one place to another. And this infestation is just keep going and going. And this is 2009. The numbers are higher now. So there's an east to west gradient, basically. And you can see here in species invasion in the Mediterranean Sea, and this by numbers, you can see the number of, the bigger the picture, the more invasive it is, the number of invasive species. And Israel is one of the biggest invasives, have biggest number of invasive species, relative numbers. And you can see 1980, 2015, and you can see there's an increase as we go into the northern part of Turkey, and basically the movement is going this way. What will happen in 2050, nobody knows. But I expect that this trend is going to continue, and we're going to see more organisms in this area. It's going to be larger, and we don't know exactly what will happen in the future. So this is the relatively way. This is basically the pathway of invasion, going from this way towards this way. There's a little bit coming from from Gibraltar, from the Atlantic Ocean, and it's going to be mixed. And since we know this area is relatively a barrier, I would assume they already crossed the barrier. And these species will stay in this western part, and these will be increasing, and this number is going to be decreased. So this is the image that this is how we explain what we got in the beginning. Lots of alien species in the Red Sea, in the Mediterranean Sea. And by comparison to different bodies of water, you can see that it's much more extensive than other bodies of water. The question is why? Why do you think so? Why is it this body of water is so extensive? I want you to look at the Atlantic or the Baltic just to give you a comparison.
I remember from the readings as well that there's also a lot of vacant niches within the Mediterranean, and that there's sort of like a big debate between sort of invasive species effects on biodiversity, and whether sort of the paper I essentially read was sort of balancing, sort of leveraging what is truly affecting endemic species and endemic range, the endemic range, Mediterranean range. And it was sort of balancing like anthropogenic effects as well as like climate change, as well as stuff like that, and sort of the fact that there's a lack of biodiversity. So it doesn't necessarily mean that invasive species are the prime reason for the reduction or the sort of decline in or outcompeting of native species. So it's almost like they're saying that it needs to be there needs to be monitorization, but there needs to be more biodiversity and sort of filling vacant sort of niche vacancies within the body of water.
So actually, nobody knows exactly. We do know that one of the important things that the Mediterranean Sea compared to the Atlantic Sea or the Baltic Sea, that's relatively, that and the Black Sea as well there, by the way, they're relatively confined areas. They're relatively small. It's like a huge bath in essence, and it's filled, it keeps filling up with invasive species, and it's changing the local environment. And it's true what you said, is that there's a good place for them to play, to find areas and niches. And we don't know about it, if it's true that it's because the niches are open, and or it's being or the species is much more aggressive than the other ones that can push them away. And there's a controversy about this. There's a group of people that are working with Jonathan Bellmaker here in Tel Aviv, and they're finding that they believe that one of the major reasons that we see this increase is the increase in the amount of, is actually the temperature. And the temperatures that have risen, and according to temperature that is higher, now it's similar to what they had in the Pacific area, and then it can survive better than it used to be before. And
isn't that
I think it's one of the major drivers for having these specific organisms in these areas. The question, what will happen in the western part, because it's still relatively cold in that area?
Can I add, I did a paper on invasive species in the Mediterranean, and they think, you're right, they think it was to do with increasing sea surface temperature. specifically in the Mediterranean. That's why like a lot of the species that are invading are from tropical regions. And also the opening of the Suez Canal was one of the big factors in terms of new species.
For sure, we know that the opening of Suez Canal is the most important factor contributing to the invasions in the Mediterranean Sea. There's no argument about this. This is This is a consensus. The question is not if this is the major source, but how the local environment is enabling the introduction of such an increase in so many new invasive species. How come they're not battling and competing against them as well as we might have thought that could be happening? And there's a controversy about exactly how this works. But we do know the impacts. We don't know exactly how the drivers are happening, the ecological drivers are happening, and what's deciding what's not. But it's good. It's good to mention what you said. So who are the ones to be blamed? Most of them molluscan, mainly snails and bivalves, and chordates, which are fish. The numbers are higher by now, obviously. Arthropods, which is crabs, basically. Worms, flatworms, and here we go, the small ones, less important. So basically, it's not only fish. Remember, the biggest group is actually mollusks. And you can see here the number of alien species recorded in Israel, this is specifically Israel, not just the area, the Levant area. And you can see the increase in the amount of species. And remember, in the late 80s, 1980s, late 1800s, that's when the Suez Canal was opened. And it took some time for the organisms to start appearing in the Mediterranean Sea. The larger, the people, obviously the numbers are higher than what you see here now. And the origin, most of them are in the Pacific, some of them in the Indian Ocean, some of them in the Red Sea. So basically all of them come from the warm Pacific, tropical areas, tropical waters. And very few is coming actually from other locations. And how do they move? This is how they believe. Bela Galid, that's how they believe they did it. They moved probably, and where is it? You can see in 2 years before 1950, after 1950, and you can see after 1950 there's an increase mostly by canals. This is the ideas that we're talking about, the Suez Canal. By vessels, much less than it is, and aquaculture is very, very limited. Today there's more talk about aquaculture, but obviously the big problem is the opening of the Suez Canal. So the corridors are major, major deal. Check this out. What about the ecological classification of who they are? And then I'm going to jump probably forward to other areas. And let's talk about the trophic level, the habitat, the depth where the invasive species are coming, and their mode of reproduction. So most of them are carnivorous. Their habitat is very diverse, but if you look at it, most of them is benthic, meaning close to the ground. They're relatively shallow, and the mode of reproduction is usually spawners. Okay, so those who make the invasion in the Red Sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, the carnivorous, benthic, shallow-dwelling spawners, and by huge numbers, this is what you see. So it's a big trend. And the idea is about this is to think what makes an invasive species a successful invasive species. So, and I'm gonna skip this and skip that and just give you an example. Just check this out. This is medusas, and they're clogging the filtration system of a cooling system of a power plant. This is in Israel. Big problem, lots of money involved with bioinvasions. And the zebra mussel, which I promised you to show you, which is a big deal that probably came to the big lakes by boats, most likely, and was invaded there, and then all the waters around it they got invaded by this species, and look how it clogs everything. Look, all the beaches are like zebrafish, was obviously invasive species, was never there before. And it can also have some toxin to it involved. Lots of numbers, lots of this, that means a lot of money is involved in trying to evade these. I'm going to go quickly, not talk about the money, because I want to talk about ecology. So what makes an invasive species successful? So a big seminal, actually it was a book. It was written by where is it? By Elton. And you can see here, this is a citation of his book in the red. And this is, in the blue bar is a publication of invasive ecology. And you can see a huge increase that follow basically what happened with the book. And the reason is that this book has become one of the main, like the Bible for people of understanding why invasive species are successful or not. And it's important to see that the science is relatively new. Beginning of the 1990s, we're talking about 20 years of science. 30 years of science. And it's not a lot, and try to understand how this works. So this is basically the concepts about invasive species. So we had what they call the biotic resistance hypotheses, that species poor habitats are more vulnerable to invasions than species rich habitats due to the lack of biotic resistance, meaning there's less competition, less predation, or not strong enough. And obviously there's parasitism, so the lack of parasitism. And he did this, he checked them by islands. He did some experiments on islands, and he tried to do in various ways and understand how, if you have an island, how does the ability of an island to be infected by invasive species. And he came up with these various ideas of what makes a species more successful, what makes it less. So the idea about this is first that the environment needs to be very resilient to invasion of a new species. Remember, we talk about invasive species and not just any kind of species, because we do have species that come and go all the time, and not necessarily all of them are invasive. So invasive have to basically have a great impact on the environment. So this is what they came up with, the species characteristics. It's high fecundity, small body size. They have quick asexual reproduction. They have a relatively high genetic diversity, and they're very phenotypic plasticity. Remember, I remember phenotypic plasticity for the corals. They have a very broad native range, the original area where they came from, meaning they're spetters in essence. And they're abandoned in that area. And they're very physiologically tolerant, so they can tolerate new environments. In their old habitat, they used to be generalists, with a very common, and the human commensals, meaning they can survive relatively well where other humans are existing, and they don't have too many enemies. So these are ideas that came up with, and we need to remember that not all of these work together, and sometimes they have contradictory information. So this is a general thought about what makes an invasive species successful. Remember, lots of these are very similar to what we talked about, which is similar to an R strategist. Not all of them are R strategists, but some of them are. And actually, most of the coral, the bivalve, the mollusks are R strategists, and it kind of fits together.
I just have a question. If there's any sort of like knowledge or research done on invasives and their resilience to climate change, because I feel like also a lot of these, like especially ability to adapt and phenotypic plasticity are like characteristics that would be favorable for their adaptation to climate change.
Yes, there has been. I'm not sure about the new stuff, but there's been a number of papers has introduced this idea if it makes them more successful to climate change, and they do think they can actually survive better in areas of where there's climate change, which gives them the edge, the advantage nowadays when things are changing to become more spread in various areas in the world, and obviously in places where the climate change has been affecting. So we're definitely sure that the invasive species are probably going to be more successful if there's going to be major climate changes. And when I say major, I mean that it's happening fast enough that these organisms can actually adapt, and the local environment will not have enough time to adapt to the changes. It gives them an edge. Actually, what they talked about is some of the papers talk about the heating up is that water is becoming more and more heated if you go away from towards the poles. And what you can see is the species are going and escaping, those who need cold water are escaping to the poles. And those who like warm water are also going and spreading towards the pole. So it's really interesting to see how this dynamic is happening. And obviously invasive species are a major part of what's happening there. Good point. So what makes him a successful organism, and ideas about this is like this. What they like is in a certain kind of environment. First of all, which is relatively similar to where they came from, so climatically matched. That's usually a disturbed environment. They like to be, since they're generalists, they can survive in an area which has high levels of pollutants, disturbance of humans, all different kinds of things which is disturbed, and usually disturbs the local environment and the local organisms. For them, it gives them an edge because they can still survive in that environment. Areas where there's low diversity of organisms, and you mentioned before that maybe there's empty niches in the Mediterranean Sea. I'm not sure if it's empty niches, but maybe low diversity, and you did mention that. There's relatively low diversity, especially in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, which may give them an edge in basing themselves and advancing forward. Absence of predators, so they can actually survive better. And sometimes they're more apt than other predators. Presence of vacant niches, which we just mentioned. Low connectivity of food web, meaning that the food web is relatively simple, and they can have an ability to cross and use that food web relatively quickly and climb relatively quickly to the higher edges of the food web. And nutrient rich, especially for plants, if there's nutrients, plants like nutrients, and usually nutrients are, in most places are relatively low. If you have an increase in nutrients, usually by human aid, and sometimes not, but usually by some kind of human aid, then there's a good chance of these plants, for instance, sticking around and reproducing. Let's show you a little interesting thing about how they can spread themselves by using their own characteristics. This is an ascidian. Ascidian is a tunicate. Here in this paper, they wanted to check out, what makes a species successful, an invasive species successful. And they compared it two species, Controlids and Ascidella, compared to the local environment. This is how they look like, by the way. They're very, very small. It's hard to see in the picture. And the ascidians are, specifically this one, are colonizing ones. Every tiny dot here is basically one organism. And what they found that the survival of the invaders dropped down when the number of species, the native species, has increased. So we can see that if there's more species in the local environment, the chance of these ascidians to survive in a new environment is decreasing in two species which are considered as potentially invasive. Now I want to show you this, and another example of what happens with the same paper is this is the various local species that they've mentioned, the ones you see here. And here they talk about their recruitment. The recruitment is their ability to reproduce and bring new offsprings to the environment. meaning this is the dispersal stage, how much propagules they can have in one time. And actually the recruitment is who is coming back. So basically how they check it, they put little tiles and they see how much they're coming, new organisms, new colonies arriving, for instance, in Bacillus, for instance. And they see that in June, there's an increase in the amount of them, and then it drops down, and there's another one here. And for this species, it's almost all year round, but relatively low. And this species of Bugula, it's very, very small and relatively low, except one peak in that area. So these are, and if you take all of them together and put them together, it's a kind of an average. This is how it looks like. Now the Proderoidus, which is the same species, which is an invasive species, he can actually reproduce at a different time, which is not the time that you have a lot of the native species. So it gives them an edge to reproduce at a different time than the local environment, the local species are reproducing. So what you can see here, the survival of invaders was inversely related to the native diversity, but the colonization by invaders occurred when the natives are not recruiting. So there's a plus and a minus to this. Now, the thing about this is on a local, scale. If you look at greater scales, you can see an interesting picture. This is called the paradox of invasion. If you look at the small scale, this is the number of species. You can see the number of, this is the increase in the amount, this is the number of exotic or invasive species. And you can see that they're, in the local environment, there's a number of species that go down. That's what we saw before, like this. And in different area, it will be going down here. And the idea is that what happens is, if you look at a greater scale, you're going to see an increase in invasive species. And this is not because they're locally, there's more native species in general, but there's also more niches available. So they will have some local species, invasive species here, some local invasive species here. So maybe locally they're not huge numbers, but overall they're increasing, but there's more habitat. So basically, if I don't know if you heard about the species area curve. Did anyone talk to you about the species area curve?
I don't think so.
Okay, so species area curve is an important graph, I would say, or a trend in species diversity. And basically what it means is that if you increase an area, if you check a greater area, you're going to see more organisms. Think about if you take a 1 meter square and check how many organisms in that area, let's say 5. Then you go and you check 10 by 10, there's obviously going to be more species. Then take 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer and check it. You're going to see an increase in number of species until it eventually levels off. But the idea about this is the greater you see, the more area you check, there's more niches there, and accordingly, there's going to be more species. And these niches have the opportunity for these organisms, for the invasive species, to go and live in that area. So the paradox of invasion is that in the local scale, they cannot, if there's more species, they don't survive as well. But overall, if you look at it, if they move more and more, there's going to be an increase in number of niches, and they're going to be increased by numbers eventually as the size of where they're actually living is increasing. So the scale of the environment that they're actually going into promotes the survivorship. You got that?
Yeah.
Okay, because it's a funny idea. All right. All right. There's also, this is a funny one. You can see here the alien, this is the alien plants richness, the amount of species here. And you can see in the island and the continent, and this is the domestic product. And you can see, which is interesting to see, that the amount of trade, basically international trade, will dictate how much of the invasive species are. And it will also go by money. So you can check out basically the GDP of an area or a country, and according to that, have some kind of an indication if they have more chances of having invasive species or less, which is funny. So yeah, this is I just wanted to show this from the point of view of economics. All right. So how what's the classical model of invasion? Basically, how do they do it? The classical model is like this. If this is natural colonization, this is what happens. If I have a number of species here, and like here there's from A to I species, and what they need to do to cross from one place to another is they cross a biogeographical filter, meaning they could cross from one area to another. Now, if they did that, some of them cannot make it. They die on the way. Some of them can make it, and now you can find them in a new area. For instance, if you start in the Red Sea and you have a Lessepian migration, you can cross the Suez Canal, which is a filter for a biogeographic filter. Some of them can make it, some of them won't. Now they made it to the Mediterranean Sea. And now the conditions have to be right in order for them to survive. Some of them make it by physical conditions, meaning the temperature is right, the salinity is right, and some of them don't make it. And then once you get to this area here, you have the biotic filter. You have competition, you have predation. If they've been eaten, then they probably will not survive. If they will, their chances of being an invasive species is relatively high. And this is a natural way of colonization, of invasion, and which is the common way of thinking. This is how a species slowly goes. This is when you talked about, you asked me if they can jump quickly or slowly. I say this is probably the best way to colonize, and that's why I think we have a lot of Mediterranean invasions. But there's another way of doing it. What you can do, you can skip around. You can use human introduction and cross barriers, especially by the geographic barrier. And if that happens, you can have something which is different than what we had before. And now, since some of them crossed the biogeographic filter, which was for them before, it was impossible to cross, it was impermeable. Now they made it, and they can actually survive using physiological and biotic filters. Then you have the number of local assemblages of invasive species has increased. And according to this can have a dramatic effect on the local environment. The consequences are dramatic. Most of the consequences are ecological changes, change in the environment, extinction of local species, usually by competitive exclusion. They can have a change in the trophic alterations, in the change in the food web, basically. So now there's different kinds of relationships between how many predators and who are predating. There's competition between the organisms, the ones who are local, the ones who are the new arrivals. And the food web is going to be altered accordingly. If you had a balance, which used to have a lot of, for instance, a lot of predators and relatively less herbivores because they're eating them, and the number was not relatively high, then you have a lot of algae. Now, if you kill them and you have less competitors and the new species are not eating the herbivores, then, the opposite, then you're going to have a change in the environment. It's going to be either more grassy or less grassy, more algae, less algae. And that could be dramatic to the environment. There's also what we call is a threat to the aquatic biodiversity and conservation, what we call a biotic homogenization. We started looking and we're realizing that very much like the effect of humans now in the COVID and the virus, you can see that similar organisms are found in different areas in the world, which before would never happen. So basically what we're seeing is globalization of biotic organisms. It's getting more and more similar in various environments. And the threat about this is that genetic diversity is going to relatively go low. There's also geographic pollution, meaning organisms from one area are going to pollute other areas, which is basically what invasive species are. And hybridization, an organism that can actually interact with another organism and create a new species. And we have no idea how that new species is going to behave, because now it has the advantages of a local species and advantages of an invasive species. And this can be grave to an environment which cannot maybe hold this kind of changes. There's introduction of new diseases and parasites. And eventually what we see is could be also a change in habitat and spatial alterations, especially if these organisms can be local environmental engineers, for instance, ecological engineers. They can change the physical environment, and this could have great consequences on the local environment. So basically the graph, I'm going to skip this one. The idea about this, I'm going to do quickly. The idea about this is that how do species go from one place to another? They usually transport them in some kind of way. We don't know. There's various ways. This is the pathways we talked about. Then they introduce to a new environment, and then they have a time to establish themselves. And if they establish themselves, they eventually start spreading. The idea about this is basically that these original starting conditions are dramatic to the effect, because these are all of these stages here. The numbers are still relatively low, so there's a chance for invasion failure. But once you cross to the dispersal stage and the spread, you have what we call the boost and boom, and they're going to go very, very quickly. And then what you have, the way to treat them from a conservation point of view is dramatically changing. Just to show you, this is basically how it is, prevention. And then this is how you usually, the idea is how to protect them. The best thing to do is protect, is by prevention. Obviously, nobody's doing it. Then if you have small numbers, it's eradication. This was exactly what happened with the algae, with the seagrasses in California. And they were happy. They actually succeeded in eradicating it. And if you cannot eradicate it, you want to confine it to a certain area. And the idea is not to let them grow quickly. Is similar ideas like what you have in eradication, to reduce the amount of numbers. Usually, it's not successful. If you reach the stage from here on, you have no idea where it's going to go. And from here on, it's just management. How can you manage it without increasing too much and reducing the cost of what you have? Obviously, the more you start in this area, the conservation issues are going to be costing much less. If you go into the stage over here, the control of the costs are going to be dramatically higher. Okay, I think that we're going to finish here because we don't have time. And this is for you for fun. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer you. And we're going to meet in half an hour or so. Right, at 1:15.
Okay.
Thank you. That was super interesting.
Wonderful. Hopefully you learned something new about invasive species.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, okay. So Daniela and Eukarya, right? I don't remember the name. You're up next time.
Okay.
Okay, so have a break. I'll meet you at 1:15, 2 minutes after that, because I owe you. Okay?
Is it the same Zoom meeting or is it a different one?
I'm going to send you a different link, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Are we presenting as soon as we come back or at the end?
No. It's intertwined between what I say. Okay.
Okay.
I'm gonna talk to you a bit. You're gonna talk. I'm gonna talk. You're gonna talk.
Okay.
Wonderful. All right. Cheers. Have something to eat. Bye. See you later. נתחיל ב-11.